Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. So in today's video I'm going to be running through 5 different tools that you can use to blend your pencils to make sure that you get really soft and smooth shading. So the 5 tools that I'll be using are things that you probably have around the house, or if you don't, they're things that are really cheap and easy to get hold of. So for example, most of them you can get at the supermarket and stuff like that. Also, if you guys over on Patreon, I've got more exclusive footage of how I actually drew out this grid, and I'm going to be giving you guys some tips and techniques for how to lay down the pencil in order to set yourself up for being able to blend and get really smooth, seamless shading. Anyway, so the 5 tools that I'm going to be using today are tissue, a cotton bud, paper, cloth, and also your finger. So I'm just going to run through how to use those tools to not only blend graphite but to also blend charcoal as well. Anyway, let's get straight into it with the tissue. So like I said, I've laid down the pencil already. So all I did was I used the 4B Derwent pencil for the graphite, and I used the HB General's charcoal pencil for the charcoal, and I just laid down those patches of pencil, and I tried to make it as smooth as possible with as little grain as possible. So I tried to fill in all that white grain to make our job a bit easier when we go and blend it out. So I'm just going to grab my tissue, and what you're looking for with tissue, it doesn't really matter what you use, but try to get one that doesn't have like a pattern on it. Try to just get one that's really soft and smooth. So I like to wrap it around my finger so that I have more control rather than just blending it like this. Otherwise you could blend all the other areas that you don't want to blend. So I like to wrap it around my finger, and when I'm blending the graphite I just go in soft circular motions and I don't apply much pressure. So when I blend it out, as you can see, it really softens everything, and it does a really good job at blending it out to get rid of all the individual pencil strokes. So yeah, as you can see, it looks really soft. If you're doing skin, this is a really good technique to blend out a large area because the tissue can cover such a large area really quickly. So I love using this technique for skin, and as you can see, it's just really effective but a really cheap, easy tool. And you can definitely see how you can't see any of the white grain anymore, and it's got rid of all the pencil strokes. So it's really important when you're laying down the graphite to make sure that you don't press hard on your pencil, otherwise you're going to get those really stubborn pencil strokes that when you blend out are just going to pop through and you'll see really vividly. So the next tool is a cotton bud, and I'm just going to use one end for the graphite and then the other end to blend out the charcoal. So again, I like to use small circular motions like I did with the tissue. And again, this is really good for slightly smaller areas. So I do like it to use it on skin, but I don't use it for the largest areas. I'll use it to like contour around the nose or shading on the eyes and stuff like that, because you have a bit more control with the cotton bud than you do with the tissue, but it's just as effective at making really smooth shading and getting rid of all that white grain. One thing you can notice is the tissue actually lifts a lot more of the graphite and lightens the area than the cotton bud does, and therefore it means that the tissue is actually really good to use for lighting up certain areas, because if you use just the blank area of the tissue, it will actually lift some of the graphite off, so you can use it to lighten up certain areas if you don't want to use, say, a kneaded eraser. So yeah, as you can see, the cotton bud has worked really well. So the next one is paper, and I just like to get a little bit of paper, cut it out of the sheet, and I like to fold it like this to make a point so that I can wrap it around my finger like I did with the tissue. But I want a flat surface on like the pad of my finger, and again I use it in the same sort of way. I don't find this method as effective, So if I was to use paper, I like to use it in the form of a tortillon or a stump. But it definitely helps get rid of the white grain. It's not as effective as, say, the cotton bud or the tissue. And I do feel like you have to press slightly harder. But it is another cheap, easy method that you can use to slightly get rid of the grainy look. But like I said, it's probably my least favourite of all of these techniques. But if you're using paper, I'd like to use it in the form of a tortillon or a stump because it's much easier to blend out with. So, for example, I've got a stump here, which is just the same. It's just paper. But if I was to go over with the stump, as you can see, in this form where it's actually compressed into the stump, it's a lot more effective at blending. And these are really, really, really cheap. Okay, so the next method is using a cloth. And so you can just use any bit of scrap cloth. Again, I like to wrap it around my finger. And this is really, really good at blending. So again, I always like to go in circular motions. And it works as well as the others. It doesn't lighten it up too much, but it definitely gets rid of all the white grain. And then the last technique is something that I don't usually recommend because when you use your finger, it's not as archival because you have grease on your fingers. But if you're not planning on selling your work and you just want to, practice your drawing, then this is a really, really good thing to use because, everyone's got your fingers, so you can just use your finger to blend it out. But only do this if you're not selling your work. The only problem with this is if your hands are really oily, then it can sometimes make it a bit unpredictable what's going to happen when you try and blend it, because the oils may stick to certain patches and not to other parts, and so it might not be perfectly smooth. But again, I don't think it's as effective as, say, the tissue is. So I would rather use the tissue not only because it's not going to cause any archival problems, but also I just think it gives a much smoother finish. So if we were to compare them with the versions up above, you can see that every technique has softened out the graphite, has got rid of all of the white graininess. But yeah, I definitely think the tissue and the cotton bud are my favourites out of all of these, and those are the two that I use the most. Okay, so now we're going to move on to blending the charcoal, and again I'm starting off with the tissue. So I'm just taking that same bit of tissue, but I'm going to take a clean area, wrap it around my fingers, and I'm just going to blend it out like before. Charcoal gives off a lot more powder than the graphite, so it's a lot messier, but it also means it's really easy to blend. The only problem with charcoal, which I always say in my other videos, is that if you're trying to blend an area that's quite light and you apply the charcoal, then you are going to see a bit of graininess because charcoal is always quite dark. So for example, the graphite lead I said was a 4B, but the charcoal was only a HB, but it is so much darker than that graphite. And so I like to just use loose charcoal powder for lighter areas and not actually apply charcoal directly on the lightest areas, otherwise you might see the grain of the charcoal showing through. But again, the tissue has softened it out, but it did lighten it a bit, so you've got to bear in mind that it does lighten it up quite a bit. So next with the cotton bud, like I said, this cotton bud gives you more control, it keeps it darker. And I think because it doesn't lighten it so much, you don't see as much of the grain coming through. Okay, so next I'm going in with the paper and I'm just going to use my stump. and you can see how much messier the charcoal is. So I think I rub my, did I rub my hand on this area? I might have done. And that's why when you're using charcoal, you just have to be very careful with where you're placing your hands. I know it's going out of the box. I'm not really worried too much about keeping it in the box area. I just wanted to show you how it actually gets rid of all that grain. So I know it's a bit messy. So again, that's done a really good job. On with the cloth. So I don't like the cloth too much on the charcoal because even though it does blend the powder around and it has softened it out, you can still see a lot of the grain of the actual charcoal. So it doesn't do such a great job at really blending out that charcoal and breaking up that grain. Whereas I think the cotton bud did a much better job. It just seemed to lighten up certain areas but keep a lot of the thick dark grain in certain areas as well. Okay, and then finally using your finger, and you can see how dirty my finger has got just from the graphite. So it's going to be really dark after blending the charcoal. And personally, I don't like blending charcoal with my finger just because of how dirty it makes your finger. But it is actually probably one of the most effective tools out of these 5 for blending the charcoal. Because as you can see, it really diminishes the grain of the charcoal, but you can see that it really smooths it out as well, and it keeps it really dark. So if you're not really bothered about getting your finger really dirty and you're okay with it being a bit messy, then definitely using your finger is a great option if you don't matter, if you're not worried about selling your work and stuff like that and aren't worried about the archival problems. I suppose if you were to wash your hands first and make sure they're really dry, then it might not be as big of a problem. But yeah, definitely I think that is the most effective way out of the charcoal, and then I would say using the cotton bud is really good as well. Anyway guys, that's it for today's video. I hope you found it useful and learnt some new tools that you can use for your blending. If you're new to my channel and you found this video useful, then I have multiple tutorial videos every single week, so feel free to hit that subscribe button and join me here. Like I said, I've got more tips and techniques for laying down the colour over on my Patreon page, and I will see you guys tomorrow in my next tutorial video. See ya, bye!